In today's episode of the Back in Shape podcast, we're going to be talking about the flat lower back. Is it causing your back pain? Is it contributing to it in the first place or preventing it getting better? And really help you understand what it even means and how it comes about for many of us under the radar. It's a feature that we're seeing more and more. And with the wrong sort of exercises, the flat lower back can be made even worse. And with the right sort of exercises, the right understanding, we can really start to make significant improvements in that. And it'll start to make sense just how biomechanically inefficient that flat lower back is. And moving forwards, making changes in the way in which we're doing things, we'll really be able to get some good improvement in our overall back resilience and health for the long term, whether or not we have a lower back injury, because quite often is the case that we have the flat lower back before we have the back injury per se, and that just makes the whole thing worse, the fact that it is flat rather than its neutral position. And when we talk about a flat lower back, know that we are talking specifically about the flattening of the lumbar lordosis. And as always with this, with the podcast episodes, there is a full article that goes into detail here as well. So you can feel free to check that out after you've watched the episode, and the comment section is there to help you get a better understanding of this particular topic. So please feel free to use it. We read and reply to all of your comments. So with that out of the way, let's start off with understanding what is normal. And just so you guys know, we've got a lot to cover here. So I've got some points on the board to make sure that I cover as much as possible. Again, that's why the comments are there. Inevitably, there are going to be some questions. I can't cover it all, but we'll be as thorough as possible with these little prompts that we've got up there on the board. So what is normal and why is it important? Well, we need to understand what the normal position of our spine is first, and understand that we all developed with a C-shaped curve through our entire spine as we were in the womb. We can imagine that we were curled up in that womb with a uniform rate of curve, or a continuous curve going the same direction. It is only through our early years we start to develop these curves, and I won't go into detail in that here, but suffice to say, our development as an early child, as a toddler, as we go through our growth spurts, sets in these natural normal curves. And the normal curves are measurable. We should have a smooth backward bending curve in the neck, a forward bending curve where the rib cage is, a backward bending curve in the lower back, and another forward bending one in the sacrum. The sacrum obviously being a fused set of 5 vertebrae, so that doesn't really move much. But we should have this normal alignment, and a backward bending curve is pivotal. But if we go a bit deeper than that and start to understand that backward bending curve, we can start to see why a flat lumbar spine is going to be a problem. So in the lumbar spine, we have the 5 lumbar vertebrae, then they connect to the sacrum. And we include that connection as we're talking about this because the lumbosacral junction is very relevant to our lower back health as well. Mainly, as we'll get onto later, the L4-5, which is the 4th and 5th lumbar vertebral joints, and the L5-S1, the junction between the lumbar spine and the sacrum, are the most commonly injured when it comes to the lower back, the root cause of things like sciatica, etc. So it's very, very important. We can't dismiss that particular connection. But on the front of this curve, because the curve themselves, the vertebra just blocks, they're not suspended in animation, they are supported in a system of guide wires, if we will, which is then reinforced by the musculature and moved by the musculature. But on a deeper layer, we have on the front of the vertebra, preventing it from bending backwards more, if we will, or holding it in tension to maintain that side of the equation. We have the anterior longitudinal ligament, a thick ligament that runs along the front of your vertebral bodies on the front of the disc, and that will arguably blend with the front portion of the annulus fibrosus of your disc as it goes through. We also have the psoas muscle, which is going to attach on the front of the spine, and we could, by extension, refer to the abs as well. They're going to be on the front of the spine, rectus abdominis perhaps, and we can make a statement that is what is supporting the front of your spine, but only really one major ligament. Then when we go to the back of the spine, we have the posterior part of the disc, so the posterior part of the annulus. We have the posterior longitudinal ligament, so the ligament that is the brother or sister of the anterior longitudinal ligament on the front. We've got the posterior on the back, and that holds everything tight. Then we've got the ligamentum flavum. Then we've got the interspinous ligament. Then we've got the supraspinous ligament. Then we've got the thoracolumbar fascia. Now, those are a number of fibrous bands, ligamentous type structures, and then in the last one, the fascial type structures, collagenous connective tissue, that all supports the backward bended position. So the position like that, they support this side. They are the string on the bow, but it's not just a tiny little string. It's tons of support to maintain that backward curve. That's really important when we think about it. The integrity that system needs to maintain. And it is the interplay between the set position of the bones lining up above themselves, maintained by this system of tension that holds that spine in its natural neutral position. Then, from there, it allows suspension, shock absorption. It allows movement in all ranges, including flexion. all the way around. And that is a normal functioning spine. Then we've got the muscles that act on the back part of the spine. We've got the erector spinae. We could consider QL, quadratus lumborum, being a muscle that is kind of blended in with the erector spinae muscles. We've got the lat dorsi coming over the top, plugging into that thoracolumbar fascia. We've also got the glutes, which we could talk about by extension, because they're going to blend and hold that thoracolumbar fascia tense. We've got a lot of support. And the reason I'm going through this is to just give you an idea of how much support you have. Maybe the maintenance of that backward bending curve is important for our function as human beings. And maybe the elimination of that curve is probably not a good thing. Now, if we think about that bow and arrow analogy, in the case of the bow and arrow, we have the bow, the thick, the solid part of the bow, which moves a bit, it's got a bit of flexibility, right? And then we've got the muscles and the ligaments, etc., on the back. And if we pull the bow backwards, which we can do, we can manipulate that curve and support it, etc. If it may be flattened out a little bit, we can pull it to increase the curve. In the case of muscles, they can't pull backwards because they don't have that third anchor point. They can just shorten and contract. So they contract and pull it down. Now, the problem in the flattened lumbar spine is that if it's completely flat, i.e. there's 0 degrees or 180 degrees between all the vertebrae, they're in a straight line. If the muscles contract, they can't pull away to make the curve. They just contract, and it starts to become dysfunctional. If you try and visualize in your mind how something that can only contract on a straight line or a straight rod, it's just not going to work well. And we start to see not only the inability of these muscles to function correctly and effectively in the person, but we also see that the muscles were supposed to run from A to B, and if you're watching this is going to make a lot more sense. As we flatten out the curve, all of a sudden A to B becomes a longer distance, and therefore this gives rise to that constant phenomenon. Those that actually experience this most are those with a flat back will experience often the greatest degree of tension, stiffness, tightness in their lower back, and those are the ones that go to their osteopath, they go to their physio, say, I've got a tight back, and then they go and do some more stretching. You need to do some, you're afraid of flexion. Do some more stretching, some more flexion-based exercises. Hug those knees to stretch those muscles out. And it's like, no, you don't need to stretch those muscles out anymore. They are already being pulled apart by virtue of the fact that you have a flat back. And it's just a complete and utter failure to understand the mechanics that leads to the prescription of those sorts of exercises. So that's really, really important that we understand that, because that's going to form the foundation. But know that if we do have a normal lumbar spine, we've got good flexibility. We can move in all ranges. Nothing is vulnerable, if we will. So now if we get into the problem with the flattening of the lower back itself, it's that when we look at the makeup of the lumbar curve, most of the curve comes from the bottom part of the spine. It's curved more at the bottom and less at the top. This is called an elliptical curve rather than a circular curve. A circular curve would be like a ball, okay? Elliptical curve might be considered maybe like a rugby ball, perhaps. Not too dissimilar. But when we think of the curve, most of it is lost at the L4-5 and L5-S1 segments when we look at the flat lumbar spine. And this is just based on literally thousands of x-rays looked at personally. Over the years, you see flat lower back, we're looking at L4-5, we're looking at L5-S1, they've done pelvic tucks. Those are the segments that have moved furthest away from their normal resting position. And it's worth bearing in mind, this normal resting position is significantly researched, looking at what the normal position for a lumbar spine is. And also know that there is a significant variance from one person to the next. It's not like you have to be right on a pin edge. It has to be exactly here, otherwise you're not normal. There is a wide range, a wide berth of a normal lumbar curve alignment. But flat is not anywhere near the normal. So please bear that in mind. We don't want to be alarmist on the one hand and say, oh, any deviation from the numbers is bad. But quite equally, flat is not normal. So we have to make that very, very clear. So when the change, the loss of curve happens in such a pronounced way at a specific segment or segments of the lumbar spine. Remember we mentioned earlier that tension that goes through the entirety of all those ligaments that were supporting the natural position of the spine. Now one section has lost a little bit more than the other, and we're not even talking about having back pain just yet or a back injury just yet. We're just talking about the process of losing that alignment. Now this one section, let's say it's L4-5, has lost a significant amount of its backward bending, and we'll get onto why that is a little bit later. It is now going to be moving a little bit more than the others in many cases. It would behave differently. So now we have this weak link in the chain that starts to develop and develop and develop. And that is one of the big issues. And it most commonly occurs, again, at L4-5 and L5-S1, which is why most of you watching this have issues in that region. That's not to say there aren't issues in other areas, but quite commonly, when you look at these things on the images, you see the flatness of the lower back comes from that section. Higher up in the lumbar spine, we start to see a kyphosis creeping into the lumbar spine in the more extreme cases, but that isn't a flat back, that's a rounded back in the wrong place. Pure flat backs, generally, we're looking at that L4-5 and not generally, nearly always, we're looking at the L4-5 and L5-S1 region. being significantly away from where they should be. Then we get onto the problems that arise when we have that injury. When it comes to injuring those segments, we're putting significantly more pressure on the discs by virtue of losing that backward bending, because as we shift away from that backward bending, we shift onto the discs on the front. And then we start to drive the disc material, the central part, the jam, if we will, towards the back part of the disc, putting pressure on the ligamentous annulus fibrosis, and that over time gets injured. When it gets injured, we get some sort of disc bulge, we get some minor disc strain, etc. We get inflammation. With a lot of people, they go and have an MRI scan or whatever the case may be, and they say, oh, you've got a disc bulge. Oh, but don't worry, it's not pressing on a nerve. And then you're left there going, well, why do I have pain then? Why does it come and go, etc. A lot of that is down to when you flare up the injury, it swells up. Inflammation builds up in that area. And in that area, around that segment, as the segments themselves bend into a position of flexion or forward bending or flattening out, the little area, the little hole where their nerves come out on the back, and we've discussed this in other videos, gets larger. So it can be filled more with inflammation before it reaches a critical mass and starts to put pressure on the nerves and irritate the nerves, and we get pain. When we have that inflammation, what do we get tempted to do? Knee hugs, make the hole even bigger, flex even further forwards, perpetuating the fundamental problems that led to the flattening of our lower back in the first place. So it creates a very, very vicious cycle where there is excess inflammation, because it causes us to want to do more flexion more. The answer to this, we get into this in other videos, is fundamentally we need to stop aggravating the lower back, and that means you need to stop the aggravation first so you don't get the inflammatory reaction. We can't always do that, but we can, in most cases, have a significant impact on the way in which we do things on a daily basis in our daily lives, because that is often the source of a significant number of flare-ups, irritations, aggravations, and build-ups in that inflammation. So we feel like we need to do the flexion. So very, very important. Then we can make use of other things like icing to help calm that down, a little bit of movement to help calm that down, i.e. walking around, etc., to help prevent that inflammation building up to particularly high levels. But it's often things like sitting for long periods, unfortunately, going to bed and sleeping and being still, which is why back pain is often worse first thing in the morning, because of that build-up of inflammation overnight. So we want to try and steer away from being still for extended periods. That doesn't mean doing loads of flexion, but it does mean being mobile and trying to move around a little bit more. So then we get into the real driver of this whole process, and that is sitting. The way in which the ligaments work, they allow you to move into any direction, forward, backwards, and as we'll discuss in a moment, flexion is not a bad thing. It's a movement that no different to flexion of my elbow. It's not bad per se, but when it's done at certain times, it is problematic. And the problem is it's done disproportionately in modern life. We mentioned in the last couple of podcasts, because of the ability to put a number on the figure, 9.5 hours is the average number of hours every day a working age adult spends sitting. Sitting, mostly not in a good position. And that's at home, that's in the office, that's on the way to work, etc., etc., etc. All of that pressure puts flexion into the lumbar spine for the vast majority of us. And that is one of the drives in these processes. We can quickly move down to tie our shoelaces and then come back up again. And the ligaments will stretch open and then they'll stretch back. Boom, no problem. But when we are sat for 40 minutes, maybe while we're having dinner watching TV, when we're sat for 2 hours on the way to work every morning, or 1 hour on the way to work every morning, or 2 hours to the airport in the car, when we're sat for the last 3 hours of the day trying to get that deadline done, every single day, over weeks, over months, over years at a time, we start to deform and change the structure of our spine. And that is where the problem arises. That's how these things creep in. We do not develop a flat lumbar spine over a week, over a couple of days, over a couple of months, really, it is over many years that we develop these sorts of flattening of the lordosis, because our body wants to remain normal. But it is the consistent use of that sitting and other activities that create this flattening. Then when we have an injury, that sitting is made worse or makes the situation worse, because now we've got that segment, let's say L4-5, that's already flattened out a lot, stretched those ligaments, the discs, etc. Now we injure those, and there's actually tissue damage, significant tissue damage, and then we flex even more, so we stretch them out even more in a short period of time as well. Maybe we're doing some, knee hugs, child's pose, etc., to flex it out even more, unaware of the impact that we're having, the negative impact we're having, further destabilizing those segments. And then it makes it so difficult to start to come back, because we've just got that instability there. And so many movement patterns that are ingrained into our mind that put flexion, that it's quite difficult to start to break that. Not difficult, not impossible. We just need to be more conscientious, and we need to understand that it is a problem and then move forward from there. Now, I put something, and I won't go into it now because we'll get it wrong, but in the article, I put 4 questions you can ask yourself, because as I said earlier, flexion is not bad. Flexion at the wrong time is bad. But people often ask us, say, hey, look, shouldn't I be incorporating flexion into my daily routine? And we've got these 4 questions that you can answer. And I almost guarantee none of you will answer correctly to all 4 of them. But if you do answer all 4 of them, you can then consider, if you do not have a flat lumbar spine, you could consider the appropriateness of flexion. But the chances are, I'll just cover them briefly, but the specific way I ask them is very important. Are you still spending numerous hours sat down every day? You're doing plenty of flexion. You don't need more. Are you someone who's strong enough? You've got the appropriate strength and stabilization of your spine, able to do simple movements like the squat, the hip hinge, the lunges, to appropriate full ranges of motion with load, i.e. indicating the strength objectively. Can you do that? In most cases, people cannot. Do you have appropriate flexibility of the hips? So can you move those hips fully through those ranges of motion? Again, probably not. Those are the sorts of questions that we're looking to answer. And if you answer correctly to those in the article, then you could consider flexion. But again, what we find, and we're talking about thousands of patients, we're talking about hundreds of members, if not over thousands of members, they cannot do those things. They are still doing sitting. So there is no need for flexion in the program, certainly not in the early days. And once you build up to the point where you do have checked off all of those things, I'm not doing that, I'm doing that, I'm doing that, I'm able to do that, then you can maybe consider the appropriateness. And note, I didn't say add it in. I said consider the appropriateness of it, because the reality is life still involves flexion. We're still going to go down, bend down to put our shoes on. We're still going to be doing things that involve those amounts of flexion. And that's something that we must acknowledge. So the last thing I think I wanted to touch on before we get into some useful tips for you guys, 5 specific action points that you can take away from this particular episode, is just the reason why the flat, explicitly, the flatness of the lordosis occurs. And it is the constant strain under ligaments that causes them to deform under that load. And this is very important because most of you will have an injury profile that occurred in flexion. It is very rare that you went backwards or did something like that caused the pain. Unfortunately, when we have instability, often when we go up backwards, there's a bit of shearing that takes place because there's not the integrity that there should be because of the loss of curve. However, we won't get into the weeds there. When we're talking about that sustained stretch, it's often bending down to do something that caused that back pain in the first place, that set it all off. It was flexion that preceded the injury, whether it was an extreme flexion or a minor flexion. One of the reasons for that is it's often after a long period of sitting, i.e. where we've been stretching those ligaments out and they've deformed. One of the things that we get members to do, or people where we've got verifiable x-ray findings, is something called derangement. That is used where you make significant change in the alignment of the ligaments in a 20-minute period, and it's done repeatedly over a period of time. After doing that, you do not do things because your alignment has changed. If we take this to the example of the clumsy teenager, why are they clumsy? The teenager's clumsy when they go through a growth spurt because their brain and their body doesn't know where the one is. The brain thought that the legs were this long and they're actually this long. So the muscles are working over this joint. The joint receptors aren't quite there. It hasn't settled into that new alignment, that new anatomy. When we sit for these prolonged periods and we change the alignment in our spine by getting that creep occurring, we have this window, and it's only a short window, it's like 20 minutes, half an hour, it's not a long period of time, but we have this short window where the brain is like, what is going on here? Or I think it's the old alignment and it's actually stretched out and it's different. You feel different after you've been sitting for an extended period of time. You even know it. But then when that happens, and just by chance, you then have to quickly go and empty the bins because, maybe the bin truck's there and you've been sat down for a long time and you've got to go and empty the bins. Then you go and do something that's active with that slight vulnerability, and that's when you flare things up. So it's just something to think about, those little risk profiles, risk opportunities because of that sustained stretch. So try your best to avoid excessive sustained stretch, excessive sitting, because that is one of the contributing factors to injuries that occur when we have that flattening of the lower back. So now let's finish off with what you should be doing with regards to 5 steps that are going to help you. Number 1, these are all to support the natural curve in your lower back. Number 1 is the towel exercise. Why the towel? Because it's a gentle way to support the natural lordosis. You can use it lying on the floor when you're lying on your back, placed in the lower back to support particularly L4-5, L5-S1, and to a certain degree L3-4 as well. You can also use it when you're sat down in the office. You can place it down in the lower back and it's going to support your curve a little bit more. And it's generally better than using things like lumbar supports, etc., because they're so fixed that you can easily start slumping into them and actually make the problem worse. And the towel is actually going to slide down and move out the way, and you'll know it's moved. You'll feel it, oh, it's in the wrong place now. And then you'll lift it back up. You won't quite feel yourself slowly slouching down into that chair when you've got the fixed lumbar support. So a towel generally works a little bit better. Slightly smaller when you're sitting than when you're lying over it on the floor. Then we've got the towel mobilization. This is a really cool one where you take that towel, you unwind it and roll it up to it's a little bit thinner, lying on your back, and you pump through, you pump into extension. And there will be a video that we link to just so you guys can see exactly what I'm talking about here. So definitely check that article out if you're interested in this one. It's a really nice option, and it's actually better than the next one, which I'm going to talk about, which is the Cobra. The Cobra is one that some people like, and we would say that once you're out of pain, once you're really in a better position, the Cobra can be used to help offset some of the flexion that you have to do on a daily basis. Maybe you are a desk worker. That's not going to change. You still have to sit down. You still have a long drive. Using something like the Cobra can help. The problem with the Cobra when you have a lot of pain, or when you're early on, or when you have a disc injury, or when you have some degree of bony spurs or degeneration, is that when you go back into that Cobra, it doesn't have that secondary tractioning and stretching effect. It's just a compressive backward bending. So you make those holes smaller where the nerves come out of. And if we've got a bit of disc or some bony spurs, that can sometimes be painful for people. And it is what it is. So the Cobra becomes not a one they can do. But that towel extension that I just mentioned is because as you pull up with the towel, you use a fulcrum, and that creates a little bit of stretch through the lumbar spine. And it's really nice and gentle and doesn't require a significant amount of upper body strength, as opposed to holding yourself up in that extended position in the Cobra. So something to consider. Cobra can be a place, but equally, if it's not for you, it's not for you with regards to the timing and with regards to maybe some anatomical features in your spine, stenosis, etc. Then we've got the hamstring stretch. Hamstring stretch done correctly. So many people do a hamstring stretch thinking, oh, I need to stretch my hamstrings. And all they're doing is stretching their back. Their back's rounding over like a fish hook. It's not appropriate. They're not doing it correctly. However, when we do the hamstring stretching correctly, with good form, actually stretching the hamstrings, just moving about the hip with a hip hinge, we can actually really help the state of a flattened lumbar spine, because it's those hamstrings, if they pull down, they pull the pelvis into posterior rotation, and that has the effect of flattening out the lumbar spine, particularly L5S1 and L45 again. So by keeping the hamstrings more supple, we can have an impact. But the other problem is that when we have a lower back injury, when we're in that earlier phase, stretching is quite useless or quite short term, because you do the stretching and then you injure your back again, you flare it up doing something because you haven't made significant progress from a point of view of strengthening. And then that sends signals back down to the hamstring to tighten back up again. So you're like back to square one all the time. So stretching is necessary. Done correctly, it can be a helpful tool, but it's one that you have to do regularly and doesn't build any cumulative progress, as opposed to the last point, which is strength and resistance work. Building up the strength and supporting structures. We mentioned, at the very start or the early part of this podcast, so many supporting muscles that work on supporting the natural posture in our lower back, or supporting that area from flexing forwards, from tipping over forwards. Working with resistance training, starting to build some tolerance is the most important thing, because that will allow you to get something that can't be taken away from you with a simple flare up. The skill of being able to do those exercises correctly, the strength that develops over time in both the muscles, but also the ligaments, tendons, etc., the bones, the joints, that doesn't go away overnight, even if you have a little flare. And that's why you see that as people progress through, for example, the Back in Shape program with us, they find that, flare-ups happen, life happens. You do something that you didn't anticipate, or you do something that you knew was going to be bad, but you had to do it anyway. And you have a flare-up. But when you have made strengthening improvements, those flare-ups last less long, they're less severe, you recover and you bounce back much, much faster, because you've done stuff that actually you keep. You keep that, as opposed to flexibility work solely, which can be lost very, very easily if we have those flare-ups and we do it at the wrong time. So hopefully this episode of the Back in Shape podcast has been helpful. If you've got any questions, anything that didn't quite make sense about the flattening of the lumbar spine or lumbar lordosis, or you're not quite sure on what you should do going forwards, then use that comment section below. We're always there to help you guys out in the comments, and hopefully this made a lot more sense. And the flexion in particular has been something that you start to understand a little bit more now. You can see how it is so prevalent in our daily lives, and how perhaps we don't really need to add any more in our exercises. And if you're someone with a flat lower back, you really can steer away from that for the time being. Start to understand that the tension that you feel in your lower back makes sense, but it doesn't need more stretching out, more flexion. It needs to be restored back to normal so that those muscles can finally sigh a breath of relief. Thanks for watching us. Hope this podcast has been helpful. If it has, and you know someone else that could benefit from it, consider sharing it with them. Consider subscribing to the channel so you don't miss out. Every single Sunday, we release the podcast. It comes out like clockwork, and we look forward to seeing you on the next one.